Good morning, everyone. So for those of you who are just joining us, we are following this book, God, Improv, and the Art of Living, for our sermons this year. And for those of you who have been here a while, you already know that. But in this book, we're looking at the practice of improv in acting, where actors act out something, a skit or something, without a script and without preparation. And instead, they're just creating a story as they go. And an important way that they do that is by an actor building on what the actor just before them said or did. And so the idea is, we keep hearing about yes and, right? So the idea is, yes, I accept what you just said, what you contributed, and I build on that by saying something else. And when you do this, you move the story forward. We call that the yes and. So we're taking that principle and we're allowing it to challenge our faith. Yes and. We're allowing it to help us to work together to move our story along. So we're allowing it to challenge our faith. We're allowing it to challenge our vision and our mission as a church. We're allowing it to challenge us to be innovative in doing new things and to trying things in new ways. And we're allowing it to challenge us in the way that we relate to each other, in the way that we relate to those in our families, and the way we relate to our coworkers, our neighbors, everyone that we come in contact with, because we believe that God improvises. God is at work in the world, and as God does that, God improvises. God has to, because we're involved. God takes our what we contribute, and God says yes to that, and God takes it a step further and then just builds on what we have. So we can think of God more like a realist than an idealist. And God is this way because God is loving. God is loving toward us. God doesn't demand that things be a certain way. Contrary to what you may have heard, God is not rigid and inflexible, but instead, God works with us. God participates with us as if we're in an improv skit. And if God wasn't this way, if the way that God was, that everything had to be perfect and everything had to be exactly the way that was the best way for it to happen, and God was rigid and inflexible, if that's the way it was, then the world would definitely be a much different place, wouldn't it? But no, God works with us. God doesn't unilaterally act to work in the world. God works with us. That's how God is. It's in God's nature. It's a part of God's character. And it may not be necessarily improvising may not be a part of our character, but we are becoming, we are changing. Our life's work, God's work in us, is that we are being transformed. We're spiritually maturing. We're all becoming more emotionally mature. God working God's character in us. And Jesus, in doing that, Jesus is our role model. And as disciples, remember, disciples means a learner or a follower, right? So we're disciples. So we're, as disciples, as learners, as followers of Jesus, we're learning to do life the way of our leader, our role model, Jesus, and God living through Jesus. So let's look at Jesus in the story this morning, the scripture that was just read, in the Gospel of Luke chapter 8. And this story is also in the Gospel of Matthew and Mark with some different details. But in this story, Jesus is crossing the lake. He's in a boat with the disciples, and they're coming back from the other side of the lake where Jesus is performing miracles and doing healings. And they're crossing the lake in the boat. And the waves gently rocking the boat, the cool air around them, maybe on their cheeks, the sweet sounds of the sea in their ears. And as they're in the boat, in the silence of this time, I bet Jesus is present in that moment. And I bet he's also reflecting on what just happened, the time that he was on the other side of the lake and the great things that God did through them. And I bet he's also looking forward as to what's next. He's thinking about what's next. He might even have a plan. Maybe in his spirit, maybe he's hearing from God where to go or what to do, or what's next. Because he's smart enough to know that you don't go it alone. Whatever great work you do in the world, whatever good you do in the community, it's not only out of your own ideas. It's not only a result of careful planning, but it's a result of hearing from God. Jesus hearing from this one that he calls Father. And there's a place in the Gospel of John where Jesus says, I do only what I see the Father doing. Think about that phrase. I do only what I see the Father doing. And you can substitute mother in there too. Our relationship with God is like the relationship that we have with a good father or a good mother, a good parent, or the relationship you have or had with an older person who used to care for you. It's an intimate relationship. It's not just up here. I mean, it's up here, but it's here. A relationship with God is like that of a close relationship that you have with a loving parent, with a loving caregiver. But Jesus says, I do only what I see the Father doing, what I see my heavenly parent doing. So what does Jesus, our role model, the one that we're learning to do life like, what does Jesus do? What Jesus does isn't just what he wants to do. It's what he believes the Father wants him to do. What Jesus does next, as he's thinking, get out of the boat, what Jesus does next isn't necessarily only out of his own good ideas, but it's what he perceives the Father's ideas are for him to do. What Jesus does, the works of Jesus, the good in the community, the good in the world, it isn't only a calculated strategy. It isn't just a tried and true calculated strategy that has been shown that it works. It's not just that he does to change the world. It may be that to some extent, but it's not only that. It's a result of God whispering in his ear. The result of Jesus sitting in silence in the boat, taking a break from the work that he had just been doing, and in a spirit of prayer, hearing from God, hearing from the Father, and envisioning what it is for him to do next. It's like he says, what do I envision God doing? That's what I'm going to do, because I do only what I see the Father doing. So it's not my agenda, but it's God's agenda. But that's our leader. That's the one that we, as followers of Jesus, have decided to follow or to be like. So now, we too want to be able to say, I do only what I see the Father doing. So he's in the silence of the boat, Jesus is, and he may have a sense of what God is directing him to do next. You know, God usually just gives us just enough of the next step or two, right? That's why they call it faith. You don't necessarily have the whole thing mapped out. We want it that way, but that's not how usually life works. God might give us a sense, but we might just know the next step or two. You know, you probably have heard this verse in the Old Testament in Psalm 119. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Is that familiar? And you know, there's a song that goes with it. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, right? And a light unto my path. Thy word is a light unto my feet. It's a lamp unto my path. I want you to picture yourself right now. Let's say you're in the woods or you're someplace dark and you can't see and you have a lantern, or better yet, a flashlight, right? And you turn the flashlight and you're on a path and you turn on the flashlight so you can see. Does the flashlight light everything up? The whole forest up? Does it make it seem like it's daytime? No, the flashlight makes it so you can see the next step or two in front of you. Your word is a light unto my path. Your word, what God speaks. When God speaks, we can envision what God is doing, and we can see what God is doing, and we can then work with God doing that. But it's often just a step or two at a time. So Jesus is in the boat. He's crossing over to the other side. And in his mind, he's thinking, I do only what I see the Father doing. So perhaps he has a sense, right? At this point, perhaps he has a sense of what's in store for him next. When he gets to the other side, maybe he has a sense of what's next, but maybe it's just a step or two. And so Jesus and the disciples, they reach the other side of the lake. I imagine Peter, he gets out first, and he's knee-deep in the water. Maybe he holds the side of the boat, and he steadies it so Jesus can get out. Peter's used to being on the water. Jesus is a carpenter. He's probably been in boats, but, Peter's the expert. He's probably steadying the boat so Jesus can get out and the others can get out. And they get out of the boat. They're wet, bare feet now on the dry sand as they stand on the shore. Where to now, boss? One of them barks. Jesus might have a sense of what's next. He's got a plan, right? He's going somewhere. He's thinking, well, maybe I'm going to go into the nearest village and I'm going to preach. I'm going to preach the good news. Or maybe I'm going to just see what's up here on the beach, and if there's people, maybe I'll perform some healings. But he's got a plan. But he's also present and paying attention. He's paying attention to what's right there before him. Because as the boat was coming, there's a crowd of people that are waiting for Jesus and the disciples on the beach. So he sees the people, tons of people, big crowd. They're all gathered around. And then there's this man who arrives late. He's coming through. He's cutting through the crowd to get to the shore. And people are letting him cut through because they know him. It's Jairus. Jairus is one of the synagogue leaders. You could think of him as one of the pastors or one of the ministers. But right now, he's not coming across like a strong leader. He has desperation in his eyes. He's not his cheerful self. And he looks like he's about to lose it any second. So Jairus is getting there to the shore. He makes it to Jesus. His legs give way, and he just falls to his knees. He's covering his face, his voice quivering. He says, Jesus, I'm desperate, he says. I'm desperate. My baby girl, my daughter, she's sick. She's really sick, and she's dying. Please. I bet if you came to my house and you laid your hands on her, if you just placed your hands on her, I'm sure she'd live. I'm sure she'd be healed. Jesus, please, please. He's pleading to him. Now remember, Jesus, his maxim is, I do only what I see the Father doing. And he knows what the Father is doing by prayer and by paying attention. Well, Jairus has got his attention. And for Jesus, there's a lamp unto his feet and a light unto his path. And that flashlight is shining just a few feet in front of him, just enough maybe to see Jairus. Now, Jesus had a plan, and Jairus wasn't a part of this plan. He wasn't in the script. Jesus hadn't prepared for this. But Jesus is like the Father, like the heavenly parent. So instead of being rigid and inflexible, Jesus, in a way, says, yes, I had something in mind, and I can still do that, and I can respond to Jairus. It's like Jesus has got a plan, but he's paying attention here. And this man, Jairus, needs him. And I'm sensing from God, he's thinking, I'm sensing from God that this is a moment not to be missed. So in this story, Jesus, he goes with Jairus to heal the 12-year-old girl. He's got a new mission for the time being. And his disciples come, and the large crowd, they come, and everybody's coming. And they're walking, and there's probably noise, and it's really crowded. Everybody's pressing against each other. It's loud. It's kind of crazy. I bet there's joking going around. There's laughter, because where Jesus is, there is freedom. And where Jesus is in our life, where the Spirit of Jesus is, there's a sense of freedom. So I bet that there was joking going around. But even in that situation, Jesus is paying attention. I do only what the Father is doing, because what God says to him is like a flashlight, giving him a few steps ahead. But he's paying attention. And then something happens. Suddenly, Jesus, he feels something. Something hits him. Something hits him really hard. He feels it. He feels it in his body. It's like he suddenly felt weak, like power left his body. But he was able to feel that because he was paying attention. He was paying attention to his body. They're all walking along, pressing against each other. Jesus just stops. Somebody touched me, he says. I think they probably laughed at that because of course somebody touched you. We're all rubbing against each other and touching each other. And the disciples say that. They said, Jesus, come on, we're all touching each other. No, somebody touched me. I mean it. Something different just happened. Jesus is heading to Jairus' house, but he knows that something is up. This is another one of those interruptions. It's a God moment. It's another opportunity to live out yes and. Yes, I'm going to Jairus' house. And I can recognize that something is happening here. Somebody touched me. Who? Everybody's pressing together. And there's this woman. She's standing right behind Jesus. And she nervously makes her way to face Jesus. He looks at her. She has desperation in her eyes. She looks like she's about to lose it any second. Her legs give way as she falls to her knees, covering her face, her voice quivering, shaking. She whispers, "It was me. I was desperate. I was desperate. I've been sick. I've been really sick. And I just felt like if I came up to you and I didn't want to bother you, but I thought if I just touched your clothes, I would be healed. And I did it. I touched your clothes, and I think I'm healed. I felt it." She says, "I felt it in my body. I'm healed." But what if Jesus kept going? What if Jesus wasn't really paying attention? Or what if he didn't feel it in his body? Or what if he felt it, but he didn't insist on figuring it out? I mean, he's on a mission, right? He's going to Jairus' house. But in this moment, this is what the Father was doing. And so that's what Jesus does. Well, there's more to the story, but I've got to wrap this up. Jesus makes it to Jairus' house. He heals his daughter, and then he picks up where he left off. What if we lived like that, like Jesus, paying attention? Sure, we've got our own ideas and plans, and that's good. But what if we surrendered all of our plans to God and sought God for what God is doing? And then like Jesus, we were able to say, I do only what I see the Father doing. Living out that scripture, really living it out. Your word, what God says through the scriptures and what God says to us as we're in prayer, hearing from God. Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Jesus inspires me to be this way. I want to be more prayerful. I want to be paying attention. What if we all did that as a community? What if we approached everything with a first and foremost with an attitude of prayer, a practice of waiting to hear from God about what God was doing? What if we approached our careers that way, our decisions that way, the big ones and the little ones? Our finances that way. In our church, we have big decisions to make in our church. Right now, we're in the middle of assessing our staffing needs. So I challenge us to be prayerfully paying attention through all of this. And as we look at our church programs, as we look at our mission, as we look at all that God is doing. God, help us to slow down, to pay attention, to be prayerful, to be like our role model, Jesus. Amen.